is the Prevalent Risk Governance Podcast, featuring conversations with today's top C-suite executives and practitioners who not only look at third-party risk governance, but push through the boundaries to protect data. Now, here's Prevalent CEO Jonathan Dembrot and third-party evangelist Brenda Ferraro.
Jonathan and I are excited to welcome back Catherine Allen, the chairman and CEO of Santa Fe Group. As one of the prominent female leaders in risk governance, Catherine brings more than 30 years of thought leadership in business innovation, technology, strategy, and financial services. She's highly sought after as a strategic advisor for C-level executives and boards of directors in the areas of cybersecurity, emerging technologies, and risk management. Catherine, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Beyond the critical dashboards and metrics and relaying major impact in business terms, using risk Harvey balls of color, knowing your disconnects and gaps, having a holistic ERM for awareness, and making sure that the boards are eyes in and hands out, what composition do boards need to have for the future to be agile and resilient in addressing these new risks? And do you have any advice for how the CIOs and CISOs might prepare themselves to be considered for a board in the future?
A great question, and I think it is going to change. Let me first talk about diversity and the value of diversity, and then I'll come back to some of the examples of the kind of people that need to be on boards. We're doing some work, the Santa Fe Group is, with the Santa Fe Institute on, again, looking at diversity on boards, not just gender diversity or ethnic diversity, but diversity of experience, diversity of even how you were raised in a small town in the Midwest versus New York City, and how that diversity brings value to a board or to the C-suite in creativity, in better financial performance, in competitiveness. And there have been a number of studies from Morgan Stanley to Catalyst to McKinsey to Credit Suisse about the value of gender diversity on boards and how there's a correlation with better financial performance in those diversity. And it's actually very simple, and it's based, at least at the SFI, on scientific research that they're doing around diversity in nature and diversity in complex systems, that if you have different perspectives, you're more likely to see both the opportunities and the risks. And they've even found that men and women look at risks in a different way. They both look at risks, but women tend to look at it more holistically. Men tend to look at it more linearly. So having people that have those different perspectives helps a board look at the risks and the opportunities in the best way. So if you go to Spencer Stuart, who's one of the, does a lot of board searches and C-suite searches, in 2017, their top 3 requests from corporate boards were, number one, women to have more, because right now it's at about maybe 19-20% of corporate public boards are women and the rest are men, so they want more diversity. Secondly was C-suite, but not necessarily CEO. This means CISO or CIO or Chief Risk Officer or Chief Digital Officer, which is a new thing, a C-suite person, but not where in the past it's been more CEO driven. And the third was a digital or technology or risk director, someone who comes from that background. And so I think you're going to see boards increasingly add a digital risk director, at least one, maybe more. I think you're going to see them add public policy experts, or at least one, someone who understands how Washington and state work or regulators work, because it helps if you're a regulated industry to have someone on board that understands that. And increasingly, if you're a global company or even if you're just a U.S.-based company, understanding the changing political, regulatory environment and having someone on board to help navigate that is important. I think we're going to see more emphasis on communications and social media and how to manage that process. And this relates back to reputational risk. And then I think eventually you're going to see the need for talent management people. We in the tech world, or in particular the third-party risk and cybersecurity world, there's about 10 jobs out there for every person that's qualified. And it's why certifications and growing education, and again, at Penn State, the program that Prevalent is supporting is critically important, because we've got to get into the pipeline more people to fill these jobs. And again, boards understanding the importance of how you attract, retain, develop good talent is important. And there's some efforts going on in that way, not only in universities like Penn State and University of Missouri and Carnegie Mellon, but also the Executive Women's Forum. And Brenda, I know you're a big part of that, and Jonathan, you've been a great sponsor on that, is looking at helping people that are at the vice president and up level start thinking about boards, whether they're nonprofit boards or corporate boards, to think about, how do you get ready for that? How can you make a difference in your board work? And Women Corporate Directors, same thing, has a Board Next program to help get more women and people of color onto corporate boards and to think differently about those risk issues. In fact, WCD is doing a study. They'll come out with a blue ribbon study on cyber insurance and how important that is to boards and what boards need to be looking at. So I think there's, going back to my point about what we learned about third-party risk and how important it is to get the C-suite and boards aware of this. I think there's a lot more that we can do, and these kind of studies will help us, give us content to reach out to boards to understand what they need to know around cybersecurity and third-party risk.
Kathy, as we're starting to wrap up, I'm interested in hearing what you think and see for the future of third-party risk. What do you think about continuous monitoring, why you see that as important, and how can organizations have better controls for third parties moving forward?
Well, that leads right into two things. And I know Prevalent's been part of the Shared Assessments Continuous Monitoring Working Group, and you are going to be part of a panel at our upcoming summit, April the 11th and 12th, around continuous monitoring and new technologies that help to put more controls in place. We have to. I mean, it's a matter of numbers. I mean, as we continue to have more and more vendors, use more and more vendors, we have to have a way to have cost controls. And that means process efficiencies. It means new technologies, and continuous monitoring is just one example of that. So I would put that at the top of my list of how, in the evolution of the third-party risk industry, so to speak, is looking at how technologies can underlie and help us make better choices around our vendors and better assess our vendors. So that's number one on my list. I would say number two is, again, the downstream vendors, fourth party, subcontractors, really understanding who our vendors are and what they outsource to. And it's downstream vendoring, a supply chain management. But as we all know, many of the hackers and the problems happen at the most vulnerable point. And that sometimes is a third or a fourth or even a fifth party in the supply chain. So understanding how to include them into the process and make sure that we're protected. And then I think the last, actually there's two more I'll give you. As I mentioned before, cyber. I think cyber warfare, not just cyber breaches to get bank account information or credit card information. We're seeing a whole new wave of whether it's activists or hacktivists or nation state hacking or criminal hacking or just people doing it to see because they can. I think we'll see many more things hacked that we hadn't thought about, and this is particularly true with the Internet of Things. And with the latest hardware problem vulnerabilities that have been disclosed, that anything from our iPhones to our PCs to our cameras to our hair dryers could have software and malware that could impact operations or impact vulnerabilities or impact financial or intellectual property. So understanding this broader impact of cyber threats is critically important. And then I'd say the last thing, which is sort of short term but really important, is GDPR. Shared assessments, we've just launched a GDPR toolkit, and I know, again, you guys were involved in the committee that developed that. Very important new privacy regulations and requirements on behalf of the EU. And I'll give us an example. One of my boards, we took back the information, and even though we were a locally based company, a U.S.-based company, we realized many of our customers are from the EU, and these new regulations impact us. So I think that's a short term for this year for people to realize that how GDPR is going to impact them and what changes they need to put in place. And that is particularly true in third parties because, again, they hold much of our data or may have access to Europe or have data centers in Europe. So really understanding the implications of GDPR are important.
As we're bringing our podcast to a close, first, I want to say thank you because in 2013, that was my first exposure to the Santa Fe Group Shared Assessment Program. And being a participant as a steering committee member changed my career in the most fabulous way and led me to having a passion in third party as an evangelist. Is there anything that you would like to talk about with regards to the program, such as when did you start it and what was your motivation?
Well, thank you, Brenda. And you've been a fabulous partner and supporter in the various roles you've had in third-party risk. And Jonathan, you're one of the very best evangelists that we've ever had from Prevalent in understanding and helping us at the Shared Assessments Program grow and really mature. Again, I'll step back a couple of things. When I was the CEO of BITS was the Banking Industry Technology Secretariat. It was a technology sister organization to the Financial Services Roundtable. And I was the founding CEO for 10 years based in Washington, D.C. And when we started, we were on the positive side of e-commerce and what was going to happen and the opportunities and changes in the financial services industry. And after 9/11, we started to focus much more on risks, cybersecurity risks and third-party risk and other kinds of efforts. The roundtable is made up of the 100 largest financial institutions and their CEOs and their COOs, and I worked exclusively with the CIOs and CISOs and chief risk officers at BITS. And it was during that time that the CEOs of the 6 largest financial institutions and the big 4 accounting firms said, we have an issue. We continue to outsource. We have third parties, and it was the regulators were beginning, and again, this is about 15 years ago, that we started talking about the need to assess third parties, and the regulators were beginning to think more about it and how could they regulate third parties and how could there be efficiency. So the CEOs of these 6 largest financial institutions and the big 4 accounting firms said, could you, through the Santa Fe Group, not through BITS, but on the side through the Santa Fe Group, put some of your talent to developing some tools and best practices that we might create around third-party risk. So the genesis started there. We then developed it into the Shared Assessments Program, and I lose count because it's kind of went between BITS and Shared Assessments, but about 10 years ago now, it became formally the Shared Assessments Program managed by the Santa Fe Group. Most all of my talent in the Santa Fe Group, we have about 20 employees, are experts either in third-party risk or in cybersecurity or in risk management, and they help to manage the members that we have of the Shared Assessments Program. We have about 275 corporate members who, and they're from a number of different verticals: financial services, consumer products, insurance, healthcare, utilities, all concerned about third-party risk. So we have tried to create, through the Santa Fe Group Shared Assessment Program, thought leadership in a member-driven organization to create best practices, to create tools, to create vertical working groups, and a continuous monitoring working group being an example of that, to help share in the industry and create the thought leadership, the framework of thinking about risk, and providing tools, providing certification and education, providing a summit that allows for this thought leadership, providing benchmarking and research. So that's how we've evolved. And again, I have to give a great deal of thanks to you, Jonathan, and to you, Brenda, because you've been with us all the way, not only in helping with the ideas, what we should do, but helping us to make that happen. So we are very fortunate to have a steering committee and an advisory board that helps us. And again, a lot of passionate people around this third-party risk area. And I am grateful to Prevalent because I think you have always been a leader in this area and continue to show, not only to show others what we need to be doing in this, but to share your knowledge and expertise so that you're bringing along others in the industry.
Well, that's great, Kathy. Really, really appreciate your time today. I thought this was a great conversation, really, really enlightening for our listeners. And I think it's just a topic that is going to continue to be a big part of life for CISOs and executives moving forward that are going to have to really, be concerned about not only third-party risk, but other risks that are impactful to their businesses. And they should look at it as an opportunity for themselves and for their businesses. So again, want to say thank you. And Brenda and I are really excited to have this one launch. I will tell you that.
Thank you all. And I was just going to say, as I mentioned, Jonathan, you're going to be talking about continuous monitoring at our upcoming summit. But because of the work we're all doing in this industry, we now have speaking and wanting to come to the summit, everybody from Richard Clark, whose new book out, is on warnings, is out. But we have the Senior Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer for RSA. We have the Chief Risk Officer for Nike. We have the Chief Risk Officer for JP Morgan. We have an amazing group of people, and we have a number of the Partner and General Manager for Microsoft for Strategic Alliances. I think the big players, the big companies are beginning to see how important third-party risk is, and that the Shared Assessments Program is the place where all the thought leaders are. And I think this type of podcast that you're doing, and I know you have Jim Ralph and others that are coming up, it's a great way for you to share expertise and the passion we have in the industry to really do the right thing and to provide the best practices for all the companies out there.
That's great. Well, really appreciate it. I'm a little concerned about the AI comment you made before. I'm thinking about becoming a computer myself, but outside of that, I think you're absolutely right. I think people are really taking notice of what's going on, and it's exciting to be at the center of it.
A response on that AI, the scariest thing that these scientists, and again, the Santa Fe Institute was started by 2 Nobel Prize winners. It is a think tank they work on really big issues, but it's all, computer science, PhDs, computer scientists, postdocs, mathematicians, physicists, and so forth. The scariest thing they said about AI, many of these scientists, and they were there from MIT and Oxford as well as many other universities, is they're now finding in machine learning that computers are creating their own code without any controls from the scientists, and the scientists don't know how they're doing this. I liken it to a cancer inside a human body. And so it's scary because now through AI, computers can create their own intelligence. And how are we going to regulate? How are we going to manage? How are we going to deal with that? That's another thing that keeps me up at night.
Catherine, it was a pleasure having you as our first female featured guest of our podcast. This concludes our two-part conversation with you, and we want to remind the listeners about the 2018 Shared Assessment Summit that's happening in Arlington, Virginia on April 11th and 12th at the Ritz-Carlton in Pentagon City. To find more information, you can go to sharedassessments.org.
Thank you for listening to the Prevalent Risk Governance Podcast. Connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and visit us at prevalent.net. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts.